And we're live from the living room as Doug eyes up the matchday spread. He's reaching for the buffalo wing. Perfect! Hang on, what's this? Oh, he's gone for a can of Pepsi too! Incredible! What a finish! Sensational combination! Look at the delight on his face. There's no doubt about it. It just tastes better. Match days deserve Pepsi. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a pack of Pepsi Zero Sugar for today's match. It's poetry in motion.
I'm not giving up.
I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either going to be okay.
No, stop.
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
The gods purged the earth with a deluge of water. Among you, herdsmen and shepherds on the mountains are the survivors, whereas those of you who live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. And I mentioned earlier the work that I've been doing with LIDAR, showing that virtually every river that I've now investigated, certainly all over North America, and as we're learning more, yes, and what we saw in Texas,
where I live.
Well, I cite the story of my first initiation into paleohydrology, which I didn't even know the term then, was 1969. And some of these comments that have come in were like, it's, I don't know, it's the TikTok brain. It's social media brain rot. It's an epidemic now. But I was sitting on the bluffs overlooking the Minnesota River Valley. The bluffs are about 200 to 250 feet high above the valley. And where I was sitting looking out over the valley was 3 miles wide. And on the opposite side, there's another set of bluffs. And I had this epiphany. I had this sense that, because what I could see was directly below me, the modern Minnesota River had migrated, had meandered over to the base of the bluffs that I was sitting on. So I could very clearly see that it had entrenched itself, and there were small escarpments on either side of the river. And I remember looking at those and then seeing this larger valley and thinking they were almost like scaled counterparts of each other. And I thought, God, wouldn't that be incredible if this whole thing was once a big river? And then I thought, but no, that's not how it works in geology. It must have been the modern little river that I see down there now must have carved out this huge valley over many, many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years. And I kind of forgot about it. And this is 1969. And then basically between 8 and 10 years later, I really began to get obsessed with catastrophism. And I began doing research, and one of the things I came across was evidence that was emerging around 1980 for several things. Cataclysmic floods on a giant scale and asteroid impacts. 1980, remember, there was 3 independent papers published that all attributed the sudden mass extinction of the dinosaurs to some variant of a cosmic impact. And that opened the door to like a reconsideration of catastrophes in Earth history, right? Now, years later, it took me probably until the mid-'80s that the studies came out that I was able to access, and I learned that the southern outlet of gigantic inland freshwater sea, Lake Agassiz, that was a gigantic sea of glacial meltwater, one of its 3 major discharge points was at a place called Big Stone Lake, which is on the western border of Minnesota and the 2 Dakotas. And if anybody wants to, they can look at a map and you'll see this weird bump you come down the western border of Minnesota, you see this weird bump. It's right there. That was the outburst point, southern outburst point of Lake Agassiz. And a gigantic rush of water came through there. It has been named by geologists Glacial River Warren. And the estimates are that the peak discharge of Glacial River Warren, a temporary river, was 4,000 times greater than that of the Minnesota River. So that first intimation I had, I realized, well, yeah, that was real. I was having this impression of this giant river, and there really was a giant river. Later, I discovered, not much later, that there was a whole school of geology, was not prominent within geology. It was not taught in geological schools, but it was called underfit rivers. And it was a term coined by a geologist named Dury. I think he wrote it in the 50s or 60s. And basically what he was saying is that there's a lot of rivers that are flowing in these huge valleys. And those small rivers that are flowing in those valleys now did not create those valleys. They're underfit. Now, once a river, if you have a river that's only 1/4,000th of the flow that carved the valley, once that river's in the valley, it ain't getting out again. Well, so what I've gone on to learn is that virtually every river I have now looked at, North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia, has at one time or another carried gigantic flows. Now, let's think about when modern civilization rose from, between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. Where do we see the first settlements? They're along rivers. They're along coastlines, right? Now, if you have a village, even a city along a river, and then a flood comes through with a peak discharge 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 times greater than the river that's flowing there, what's going to be left of your village, of your city, of your settlement? Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. Just like Plato says, whereas those of you who live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. Once again, I think Plato is telling us an explicit truth. Nothing so far is, we can't dismiss with a wave of the hand anything he said up to this point. Then he goes on. He says, the fact is that wherever the extremity of winter frost or of summer sun does not prevent, the human race is always increasing at times, but at other times is diminishing in numbers. And whatever happened either in your country or in ours or in any other region of which we are informed, if any action which is noble or great or in any other way remarkable has taken place, all that has been written down of old and is preserved in our temples. But whereas you and other nations are just being provided with letters and other things which states requires, and then at the usual interval, the stream from heaven descends like a pestilence and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education, and thus you have to begin all over again as children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves.
Yeah.
I think he's laying it out right there. Yeah. Yep. As for those genealogies of yours, which you have recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than the tales of children. For in the first place, you remember one deluge only, whereas there were many of them. In the next place, you do not know that there dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men, of who you and your whole city are but a seed or And this was unknown to you because for many generations, the survivors of that destruction died and left no sign.
Yeah.
I can't even read that without the goosebumps going big on my. Yes, I and that is one of my areas of research that I'm really going to look into is, the geological history of the peninsula there. And I know there's going to be a story there because there's nowhere that I've looked, basically nowhere, that I've looked where I can't find somewhere that was not at some time or another affected by catastrophic events.
Yeah.
We can say that there are some areas where it looks like catastrophism played a much more powerful role. And very briefly, one of the barometers that I would use is species loss.
Yeah.
Because species loss is a function of habitat loss. Habitat loss is going to be a function of catastrophic environmental changes, right? Now, if we look at the numbers of species lost around the Younger Dryas and in the millennia or two leading up to the Younger Dryas, say between meltwater pulse 1A at about 14,600 to the end of the Younger Dryas at 11,600, 3,000-year period. North America lost 3/4 of all species over 100 pounds in body weight. So did South America. Yeah. So now Eurasia lost about 35% of its megafaunal species. Africa, 10 or 12%.
Study
and play
come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get
the best
of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
This episode is brought to you by Fox One. Watch all 104 matches of the FIFA World Cup live in 4K for just $19.99 a month with 3 days free. Build your own multi-view, choose up to 3 streams, and follow player spotlights. Stay on top of every moment with live stats, highlights, and instant replays. The FIFA World Cup, streaming live on Fox One. Offers are subject to change. See fox.com for complete terms and conditions.
So obviously, the destructive potential was not uniformly distributed around the planet. If species loss is a barometer, a measuring stick for that,
right?
It really appears that the Western Hemisphere received the brunt of whatever forces caused this, and I think the argument can be made that we're looking like Plato's describing the myth of Phaeton and the stream from heaven. We're talking about is this newly discovered comet Swan, which is going to cross Earth's orbit coming up very soon. And then Earth is going to cross its orbit on October 5th. Well, is that going to cause a meteor shower? Maybe. I hope it does. Not any big catastrophic impacts, but a nice light show. That would be cool. But, okay, let's go to the next, where the narrative goes, because this now gets us into some of the specifics. Okay. So here's the priest talking again. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories. But one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor, for these histories tell of a mighty power which was aggressing wantonly against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power, now this is very clear and explicit, came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. For in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits which you call the columns of Heracles. Now, you can research the column of Heracles, and overwhelmingly, the consensus is that that's referring to what is now the Straits of Gibraltar. Other places have been proposed, but I think it's clear from the context of this narrative that those other places are not being referred to, right? There was an island situated in front of the straits, which you call the columns of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together. Now, again, we get back to where this meaning, and we have to go back to the Greek for that, I think, because we see that the islands, plural, right? So again, using Polynesia, Micronesia, etc., as a possible analogy, if we're looking at not a single island, but a group of islands that are spread over large parts of the Ocean, right? But then what he says here, that there was an island situated in front of the straits, which you call the Columns of Heracles. Now, if that means outside, into the west of them, but that's where Madeira is found. There's another island called Spartel Bank, which was an island during the Ice Age. It is now acknowledged by geologists to have sunk. It's just outside, almost within the Straits of Gibraltar, and surrounding it is huge masses of thick turbidites, which is basically sediment that has been deposited on extreme turbidity current. So in other words, something happened, you have this earthquake, the Spartel Bank collapses, and it throws billions of tons of sediment up into the water. The water is turbulent because of the earthquake, and then it settles out. And instead of forming nice, even, consistent layers, like a nice sandwich layered up, it's full of contortions and distortions and things, and that is a turbidite.
Okay.
So there's massive turbidites on the Atlantic Ocean floor outside the Straits of Gibraltar. They're there, okay? Now, listen to this carefully. So this island was the way to other islands, and from the other islands, you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a continent. Now, if you take this at face value, I mean, it almost sounds like you're saying, well, you can go. I mean, we can look at a map, and next time we can pull up a map, I'll show you. You go out of the west of the Straits of Gibraltar, you encounter, first you sail over the sunken Spartel Bank, then you come to Madeira, then you come to the Azores, then beyond the Azores, you come to the true continent. I mean, that's really, the geography fits what he just explained to a T. Now, how do you reconcile the Reshat structure with what you just heard? It doesn't add up. I'm sorry. It's an interesting structure, and it's worthy of study in its own right. But it doesn't. And it probably did. The whole of North Africa got flooded. And in the American College Dictionary that I've had, my tattered version that I've had since 1967, Pillars of Hercules, the two promontories on the opposite sides of the Strait of Gibraltar, the Rock Gibraltar in Europe and the Jebel Musa in Africa, are fabled to have been raised by Hercules. And that is the overwhelmingly dominant interpretation of what is meant. Yep. So then Critias says, now therefore, and this is the purpose of all that I have been saying, I am ready to tell my tale, not in summary outline only, but in full detail, just as I heard it, and the city with its citizens, which you described to us yesterday, as it were in fable, we will now transport hither into the realm of fact. And then again, Socrates says, what story should we adopt, Critias, in preference to this? For this story will be admirably suited to the festival of the goddess, which is now being held, because of its connection with her, and the fact that it is no invented fable, but genuine history is all important. Now, again, my point, you cannot derive the conclusion from the narrative self that he meant this as a myth. He seems over and over again to be confirmed this is real. Well, because since 1978, it was demonstrated that, his geology was an impossibility. Or was it? So, now here's the part referring to Greece. He says, for the survivors of each destruction, as I have already said, dwelt in the mountains. They were ignorant of the art of writing and had heard only the names of the chiefs of the land and very little about their actions, as they themselves and their children were for many generations in want of the necessities of life. They directed their attention to the supply of their wants, and of that they discoursed, to the neglect of events that had happened in times long past. For mythology and the inquiry into antiquity are introduced into cities when they have leisure, and when they see the necessaries of life already beginning to be provided, but not before. In other words, the survivors of a catastrophe are so wholly preoccupied with just the challenges of surviving that it's no wonder that ancient traditions might have been lost. And now he's talking about Greece. I would have you observe the present aspect of the country, which is only a promontory extending far into the sea, way away from the rest of the continent. And the surrounding basin of the sea is everywhere deep in the neighborhood of the shore. Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking. The consequence is that, in comparison of what then was, there are remaining in small islets only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called. All the richer and softer parts of the soil have fallen away, and the mere skeletons of the country being left. But in former days, and in the primitive state of the country, what are now mountains were only regarded as hills, and the plains, as they are now termed, of Philius, were full of rich earth, and there was abundance of wood in the mountains. Of this last the traces still remain, for there are some of the mountains which now only afford sustenance to bees, whereas not long ago they were still remaining roofs cut from the trees growing there, which were of a size sufficient to cover the largest houses, and there were many other high trees bearing fruit and abundance of food for cattle. Moreover, the land enjoyed rain from heaven year by year, not as now, losing the water which flows off the earth into the sea, but having an abundance in all places, and receiving and treasuring up in the close clay soil the water which drained from the heights, and letting this off into the hollows, providing everywhere abundant streams of fountains and rivers, and there may still be observed indications of them in ancient sacred places, where there are fountains. And this proves the truth of what I am saying. Well, you can see how within the framework of geomorphology, I look at that and say, well, yeah, it sounds like he's describing a tremendous erosional event that affected the whole Greek peninsula. Such was the natural state of the country, which was cultivated, as we may well believe, by true husbandmen, and had a soil, the best in the world, and an abundance of water, and into heaven above an excellently tempered climate. Now the city in those days was arranged on this wise. In the first place, the Acropolis was not as now, for the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rock. At the time there were earthquakes, and then occurred the third extraordinary inundation, which immediately preceded the great destruction of Deucalion. Yeah. Well, and then we get into, and this answers your question, how did I focus in on, well, I've kind of given you, I've skipped over some, but enough from Plato, what he's describing, right? So I'm going to now quote from an article that appeared in National Geographic back in 1948, written by Maurice Ewing, who is considered to be the founding father of marine geology. Okay, you look him up. He's a very distinguished scientist, no longer with us, of course. But so it begins with this quote: "We're over the ridge," and that's referring to the mid-Atlantic ridge. All hands were tense as the word spread through the little research vessel named, get this, Atlantis. For it meant we had reached our goal. A mile or so beneath our keel stretched the gloom-shrouded peaks, valleys and ridges of the longest mountain system on Earth, the mysterious mid-Atlantic ridge which we had come to explore. Though our ship was named Atlantis, we had no illusions of solving that age-old mystery. But a rather wild idea had led us to devote 4 hours to a particular rock dredging. Our hypothesis was that the long level terraces, with sediments ranging up to 3,000 feet in depth, were submerged shorelines. If so, the steep cliffs rising from them should have boulders at their bases, as do wave-cut cliffs on our shorelines today. Okay. It is, of course, extremely radical speculation to identify these level stretches more than 2 miles below the sea surface as former beaches. Such a theory would require the obvious but almost incredible conclusion that the land here has subsided 2 miles, or else the sea has risen by that amount. Much work will have to be done before this startling theory can be proved or disproved. In any case, we were encouraged to find that at the bases of the cliffs above such terraces, rocks indeed could be readily obtained. And then in their journey, at another point, they say about halfway between New York and Bermuda, we brought up one of our most remarkable cores. They took cores from the bottom of the... It included sand like that found on beaches. Well, how did beach sand get here, 300 miles from any shallow water? I decided that it must have come from a mountain, now beneath the surface of the sea, and predicted that such a seamount would be found nearby. Months later, in April, a mountain, as forecast, was discovered by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Then, the following year, they went back.
Okay.
They saw enough stuff that was intriguing, and they said, we got to do a follow-up.
Yeah.
So the next year, 49, they go back.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels get you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Bring a date, your squad, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Stand by to lower away. As this cry sounded, all hands crowded to the rail of our little research ship, Atlantis, rolling easily as she lay hove to on the gray mid-ocean swells. It was a tense but eagerly awaited moment on our second voyage of exploration of the mid-Atlantic ridge, the world's longest mountain range, which runs a full mile deep under almost the whole length of the Atlantic Ocean. Some of the things we found on this second cruise create scientific puzzles. One was the discovery of prehistoric beach sand in 2 core samples of the bottom, brought up in one case from a depth of 2 and the other nearly 3.5 miles, far from any place where beaches exist today. So sometime in the distant past, this sand found deep beneath the ocean must have been located on a beach, at or near the surface of the sea. Either the land must have sunk 2 or 3 miles, or the sea once must have been 2 or 3 miles lower than now. but either conclusion is startling.
Yeah.
Now, it goes from there. Here's the ocean floor. This is from Hans Petersen. This is from a book called The Ocean Floor, published in 1958. Hans Petersen was a Swedish, or was he Norwegian? Swedish marine geologist. A very different type of deep-sea sand is found about 1,500 nautical miles further west, slightly north of the equator. Here, from a depth of about 4,400 meters, the core sampler brought up a core nearly 9 meters long, the upper parts of which consisted of a fairly homogeneous, fine-grained deep-sea clay. In the lower part, several layers of sand, which mineralogical examination showed to be not mafic, which is the material composing the ocean floor, not mafic, but of continental origin. That is, derived from a coastal shelf of some continent or, well, we could get into that discussion, and we should, because I have thoughts on that.
Okay.
I do. And,
What's
if you want, the quick version is look, modern science arose after a long, like 2 centuries long conflict between science and religion.
Yeah.
Between biblical literalism and the freedom to think and ask questions and frame hypotheses and test them, etc. The opposite of just blindly accepting something on faith.
Yeah.
Well, so part of this, I think, only part of it has to do with that, is that, if you start, like Noah's flood. Well, if you look at the simplistic versions of Noah's flood, they don't make sense. Only to somebody who's invested in a supernatural explanation that, well, you don't need a naturalistic explanation for the reality behind the flood stories, because God does things, it's supernatural. And we don't even question. It's God, right? Now the science has come along, and in authentic science, you question everything. Well, I think that's part of it, is that there was an overreaction. But I think there's also the other part, is that there is a narrative that's become entrenched, which is pretty much a framework for constructing this entire hierarchy of geopolitical power. And I think that has something to do with it. We should get into the question of, like, every time, what happens when the Chinese communists took over with Mao's revolution?
Yeah.
What happened with Pol Pot? What happened with Stalin? What happened with Hitler? You erase history, right? Because you have to separate people from their authentic history, because now you're inculcating a manufactured narrative to which they're supposed to owe their allegiance. See?
Yeah.
And I think there's a strong element of that, because I think there's a multiplicity of reasons and factions whose vested interests would not be served by overthrowing the existing paradigms of history.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it. But if we're going to continue on and prosper and create a truly, authentically enduring civilization, we essentially are going to have to overthrow those paradigms, because they are now like dead weights around our neck. Because if we don't have an authentic understanding of our past, we're not going to have any hope of surviving into. Plato is giving us clear warnings. After the usual interval, the stream from heaven descends.
Yeah.
He's giving us clear warning right there. I do believe that. And we need to take that at face value. Now, there's a whole lot more we could unpack here. And that would lead us to the question of why in November I'm going to the Azores. Because the Azores the 9 Azores islands are the tops of mountains. And they're sitting in, they're mountains that are on what is now referred to a term that didn't exist, I'm quite sure, in the days of Dorothy Vitaliano, which is microcontinent. And I can show you, just as she said, now we know that, the basalt of the seafloor is mafic, meaning it's manganese and iron. It's not of continental crust. Well, guess what? The Azores microcontinent is continental crust. I guess not for the moment. No, but we should reconvene after I get back from my field trip. And I'd have something to share, talk about, I'm sure. So I'd have some stories. And yeah.
Can't wait.
Okay, I will mention that I think we've got 3 or 4 seats left for this Azores expedition in November. I think it's, go to my website. I've got something on there. Go to Grimerica. Darren Grimes and Graham Dunlop are organizing it, and you can get your tickets through them. Cool. And I got a new website. Mike Robertson is my partner over at HowTube, is building an awesome website. And I can't wait to have it out there. People can see it. And the other thing that's in the development is we're designing a school.
Yeah.
We have just made an offer on 260 acres of land, Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee. So we'll see what comes of that. It's exciting times. But we got to do this because, there are forces of good that could carry us to heights we can't even begin to imagine. And then there are other dark forces at work that really want to constrict us, restrict us, endless forever wars, which of course can't last forever because sooner or later it's going to explode into something that's out of control.
Yeah.
And in a world of, where we're sitting here with, nuclear weapons poised at each other, we've got to have dialogue, we've got to have cooperation, and this is something that should be something that we talk about further, because there are potentials for another pathway, for another route. We are literally at the crossroads right now, I believe.
Yeah.
Not only for the history of civilization, but the history of our human species on Earth. And it's going to come down to what really just a few of us, I think, are doing. But we can tip the scales, I think, towards progression and evolution rather than de-evolution.
Yeah.
So that's something we should talk about, because Plato has given us lessons, and a lot of the other traditions have as well. And they've pointed our way into a future that we can only just begin to imagine the potential of what we could be and where we could be at a century from now. And it's up to us who are alive on the earth now to make sure that this happens. The story of Atlantis is embedded right in these very significant and substantial geological events. Mainstream ignores that fact. On the other hand, I look at it and go, well, this may be more than mere coincidence.
Yeah.
If we go to Plato's ringed structure, he describes a city plan where there are multiple rings. There's the Temple of Poseidon at the center, one stadium in length and half a stadium in width, right? It's a rectangle that's twice as long as it is high, which is the rectangle from which you derive the golden section. I would say that you're right, that most modern scholars are very dismissive of it. But if you look at the history of Atlantean thought, pretty much Aristotle and his school concluded it was fictional, that it was an allegory.
Okay.
On the other hand, the Neo-Pythagoreans, Proclus, Crantor, and that whole school coming down through the Arab world believed that it was actual, that it was based upon actual history, maybe not in every detail, and that did not exclude the possibility that Plato was using it allegorically, right? But that behind the allegory, there was a literal, factual reality. And what I have done in my approach is to go through Plato's accounts line by line. I think I've gone through 4 or 5 different translations. I've also procured the original Greek, which I slogged my way through, which I should have actually pulled it out and had it in my fingertips here, because I wanted to see, like, when he says veritable, I wanted to see what the meaning of the original Greek word was. When he says, when the English translation says island, I wanted to see what is the original Greek term.
Right.
And in both cases, I mean, it's what I expected. Veritable meant truth, that it was true, that really was. And he uses that word, like in the Jowett translation, the one that I've probably read the most, maybe 4 or 5 times through that particular translation.
Yeah.
The word veritable is used multiple times to express the idea that, hey, this is no mere fiction. This is real. I mean, he said you cannot, from the internal narrative itself, conclude that it's fictional. Because, in fact, he says the opposite repeatedly, multiple times. And we can quote, I can give you some of those quotes here. So there were 2 schools of thought. And, and that's something that's typically overlooked, is that I call them the proto-Athenians, they're destroyed. The armies, they are destroyed in what basically, using his terminology, sounds like an extreme catastrophic erosional event, which would imply what's usually the trigger of erosional events is extreme pluviation or rainfall.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what, you've got to take that into account. And looking back, the 9,000 years prior to Solon's exile, if you want to call it that, self-imposed exile to Egypt, where he heard the story, according to the account, from the Egyptian priests, that 9,000 years prior, which basically, if you figure 2,600 years ago, what Plato was like 23, like he was 350, somewhere right around there, BC. So Solon was like 4 generations previous. If you look at that, the math on that, it's very simple. Go back 2,600 years to Solon, and then 9,000 years prior in the sacred registers of Egypt, according to their sacred registers that are referenced by the priests. This is when the Great War took place, which was immediately, I think we could infer that it was immediately after this war, when the Atlanteans were driven out of the Mediterranean by the combined efforts of all of the cultural groups that existed inside the Mediterranean, but led by the Proto-Athenians, drove them out, and then essentially immediately after, there was a great earthquake. It caused the subsidence of Atlantis, and there was this erosional event that likewise, I think that was even a term used in the translations, that likewise destroyed the ancient armies of Athens and caused this, what sounds to me like an extreme erosional event. Now, geologically, which is the perspective I come from, those 2 things are totally plausible.
Very interesting.
And there's a coincidence that is either ignored, or if it's acknowledged at all, is just dismissed of having any significance whatsoever. And that's the idea that there is a proposed extreme meltwater event at 11,600 years ago. So there's a meltwater event where there's a massive influx of glacial meltwater into the global oceans, although most of that is going into the North Atlantic, which I think is significant.
Yeah.
And this event takes place now, documented through multiple proxies. Most probably importantly would be radiocarbon dating, but it has been dated to essentially 9,600 years BC, which would be 11,600 years ago, which dovetails maximally within a century, probably less, within a few decades of the date that we derived from Plato's account, that there was this seismic event along in the mid-Atlantic that referred to that caused the subsidence of the island. But my reading of it is that it's actually talking about a main island plus some subsidiary islands. It would be large, certainly, but their geographic range of what constituted Asia and Libya was much more constrained. And essentially Asia meant, going somewhat into Asia Minor, but not the whole of, Russia and Siberia and Tibet and China and all of that part of Asia. They didn't presumably have that comprehension. my suggestion is that, it does refer to an island. Obviously, if it's an island that's as large as Libya and Asia together, it doesn't sound like an island to me. It sounds like a continent. But here's where I think it could be talking. If you're talking about the Atlantean quote-unquote empire, and the Atlantean empire could include like the Azores, Macaronesia. If you look at the individual islands, yeah, they're small, they're not huge. If you look at the area of Macaronesia, it's many times larger. If you were to draw a circle around Macaronesia and include all 9 islands of the Azores, if you were to extend it even more and include Madeira and Canaries, now you've got a huge area.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Polynesia. I mean, I looked up, I think I have it in my PowerPoint show where I looked up what is the area of Micronesia, right? Or Polynesia. Well, you see that the area encompasses all of the islands of Micronesia. So if you look at it that way, which is how I think that could possibly be interpreted.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that makes more sense to me than the idea that he's talking about a landmass the size of Libya and Asia together. That doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So Solon was a famous poet, philosopher. He was a statesman, a lawgiver. He was a highly accomplished individual. He lived roughly around 600 BC in Athens. And, I don't remember the specific circumstances that led to his disenchantment with the political situation in Greece at the time. And so he exiled himself. He went abroad and he ended up in Egypt. And it was while in Egypt that he met these priests, and the priests related to him the story of Atlantis and referred to it as occurring not prior by 9,000 years, according to their sacred registers. And I'm going to deviate for a second because I've seen a lot of academic opinion that has said that, well, that's absurd because, you're talking about presumably an oral tradition that lasted for 9,000 years. Such things don't exist. Well, I would beg to differ, and I would think that the evidence suggests that oral traditions have lasted for thousands of years. And most recently, I've been doing research on the oral traditions of the Paiute and Shoshone tribes that live out in Nevada. And there's a very interesting story that has some light. So I'll take a minute or two to discuss this story. Okay, so in 1940, a husband-wife archaeologist team were excavating in a cave, and they found two cadavers that had been buried there. One was obviously younger than one. It was buried not as deep. The deeper burial was undoubtedly older, and it was mummified. Well, they estimated that the date of the mummified individual was between 1,500 and 2,000 years. Now, this is in 1940. The mummified remains, they went to a museum, and I think they actually went on tour. I forget where they are right now, maybe back in the museum out in this is in Nevada. I think there was I think they're back in the museum. They're probably sitting in storage now. Well, okay, so get this. Now get this, Michael. Okay, so here's the story. Because you said that, I'm going to elaborate just a little bit more, but I think you'll see how it has relevance, okay? So in 1997, after a long controversy because the Paiutes and the Shoshone wanted reburial under the auspices of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, but they agreed to allow radiocarbon dating, which was subsequently done. And the mummified turned out to be almost 11,000 years old. Yeah, now this is an individual found in a cave in Nevada. Okay, so now in I think it was 2004, again after more controversies and back and forth, the tribes agreed to a DNA testing, right? Well, what this showed was that this individual, who according to the tribes was referred to as the storyteller, The cave was called Spirit Cave, so oftentimes he's referred to as Spirit Cave Man, right? So they, and the man who did the DNA testing was the same individual. I believe he was Danish. Yes, he was Danish, and he was the man who did the DNA testing on the Kennewick man that was found along the Columbia River that turned out to be 10,000 plus years old.
Okay.
Right? The Kennewick, I don't know if you remember that big controversy. Yeah, Kennewick man, you might want to look him up and do a little research on that. That's Kennewick, Washington. He was found in some of the residual flood deposits of the final gasps of the great Northwest Pacific floods.
Wow.
Right? So he was probably drowned in a flood. Kennewick man, same geneticist that did the DNA testing on the Kennewick man. The tribes agreed to allow him to do it. They didn't want any American scientists to do it because they didn't trust American scientists. But they did trust this Danish geneticist. So he came in, he did the DNA testing, and sure enough, it looked like there was a genetic link between Spirit Cave Man and the modern tribes. Now, the modern tribes have their own stories and legends. They talk about that this was their ancestor, and at the time he lived, their ancestors lived on the shores of a great lake, and there were extensive glaciers on the mountains nearby, right? Well, there was a great lake. They were called Lake Lahontan that disappeared at the end of the last ice age, right? And it was probably a product of, the great ice masses over North America probably pushed this is one theory, and it makes sense, pushed the jet stream south. So during the ice age, all the deserts of southwestern United States were not deserts. They were temperate environments. They were even lush. They were like savannas.
Wow.
But they were not deserts. Well, this is 12,000, 15,000 years ago. And then even post-glacial, there was a lot of more rainfall in those deserts, just like there was a lot more rainfall in the Sahara, probably for the same reason. Sahara Desert was not a desert 10,000 years ago.
Right.
8,000, they call it the Green Sahara. Now, sure, and we can come back and talk about the Richat structure if you want. But so back to this Spirit Cave story. So the Shoshone tribes, the Paiute tribes, they've got stories about their ancestors living on the shores of this great lake that existed where it is now desert. It was called Lake Lahontan, and it was in the northwest corner of Nevada. Do you know the Burning Man Festival? Yeah. So the Burning Man Festival. No, but in the last 2 years, I'm kind of glad I wasn't out there wallowing around in the mud. I would probably be up for that. Oh, but see, I have a secondary reason for that, because what is it, the Black Rock Desert, it's called, I believe? That was where they hold that out there on that flat desert land. That was the bottom of Lake Lahontan.
Mm-hmm.
The lake, when it was at full pull, was over 500 feet deep, right there where Burning Man takes place.
That's crazy.
And I guarantee you, probably none of the attendees of Burning Man understand that.
Probably
but
not.
I would be going out there with the idea in mind is I want to study the remnants and the evidence of that gigantic lake. It was the second biggest lake in the whole Basin and Range province. The biggest one was Lake Bonneville, which were where Salt Lake City and Great Salt Lake are located. That was the largest basin of Lake Bonneville, and right there where the city of Great Salt Lake is, the Lake Bonneville was over 1,000 feet deep.
Wow.
Lahontan at its deepest point was 900 feet deep, 900 plus. So it wasn't quite the depth of Bonneville. And in the bay where Burning Man is, it was shallower. It was about 500 feet deep. Okay, so here's the point. So here's the Shoshone tribes and Paiute tribes have these traditions about their ancestors living on the shores of this great lake, which disappeared between 10 and 11,000 years ago. So they have a cultural history of that story. The 2004 genetic testing showed that it appeared the evidence suggests they were descended or related genetically to this Spirit Cave man. Now, In earlier 20th century, I think it was in 1912, there was a rancher who owned a ranch, and it was near the Spirit Cave. I don't know what he was excavating for some reason. He was excavating for a maybe a well, but there was another cave near there called the Lovelock Cave. Now, these caves, by the way, very much correlate with the high water mark of Full Pool Lake Lahontan, and were probably eroded into the native limestone bedrock by the surf and the energy of that was being expended along the shorelines of this gigantic lake. There's evidence that there was a lot of turbulence, and so Lovelock Cave also was very close to the Full Pool shoreline of Lake Lahontan. Well, in that cave in the early 20th century, they found 60 mummies. And they found some evidence of footwear that would have been basically worn by somebody probably in the range of 7 foot 6 inches tall, like 15 or 16-inch long sandals, right? So now go back to this farmer. I don't remember his name. I could pull it up here. I've written extensively about this whole episode. And I'm going to actually be doing, I'm working with my friend Beckett Fusick, and we're putting together a mini documentary about the story I'm telling you right now. But so he's excavating and he finds a skeleton. Now, according to the local accounts, and I was actually able to go back to the, what was it, the Lovelock Review, I believe it was called, and found online, they have archives from the 1930s when this rancher was doing this excavation, and I got a screen capture of the actual article where he's talking, where they're talking about in this excavation, he discovered a skeleton that may have been of an individual close to 8 feet tall. And the final point is that the tribes themselves have ancestral memories of and saying there were giants. There were giants, and in fact, their ancestors fought a war with the giants, and the final standoff between the two groups was there near Lovelock Cave. There are a lot of stories like that. And I've done some research, as others have gone much deeper than I have, but I've done enough research to think, yeah, there's got to be some historical truth to this. It's not just coming out of a vacuum. All these people are independently making up these various stories.
Right.
And you know, right here in Georgia, the Etowah Mounds, now this is interesting. We have these monumental earthworks here in Georgia, just north of Atlanta, about an hour, called Etowah Mounds. They were excavated when? In the 1940s, 1950s, I think, initially. You can go to the museum that's there on site, and they've got the displays about the cultural groups, the Native Americans who presumably did all the construction work, at where did they excavate, what were their crops they're growing, what were their lifestyles, all of this. Nowhere in the museum, at least since the last time I was there, which has been a number of, probably just pre-COVID, do they mention the fact that in the excavation of, I think it was Mound C. There's Mound A, which is the big truncated pyramid, and there's two smaller ones. And I think it was Mound C, one of the smaller ones. There's no mention of the fact that they excavated and found the skeletal remains of a giant. Yet I have the original, I have photocopies of the original report from this, where they explicitly are saying they find the skeletal remains of 7 foot plus, right, individual. So, why does not the museum even mention that? Well, maybe the insights that I kind of feel like I've gleaned from looking at paleohydraulic data and evidence for gigantic scale floods, what I refer to as biblical scale floods. And I'm not talking about, a supernatural drowning of all the highest mountains in the world by some inexplicable process. And I'm not talking about some catastrophic but merely local or regional effect. So you've got two schools of thought, and this sort of applies again to the same question of Atlantis. You've got the academic school, the scholars, which say, well, if there was any real reality to these flood myths, well, it was just a large flood, that was regionally or locally devastating. And then it just got exaggerated into retelling until it became the whole world. That's sort of the academic, oversimplified, of course, but it does kind of express the academic. Whereas on the other hand, you have the evangelicals and the biblical literalists and true believers who do believe it was a supernatural flood that, they have various ways of trying to explain it that makes no sense at all from my standpoint scientifically, where the whole planet is submerged. When you get into the details of like, wait a second, and some of the skeptics rightfully will say, well, wait a second, are you talking about, aardvarks from South America somehow getting on Noah's Ark over in the Middle East and that sort of thing? This gets us into another question, because I think that maybe what is being referred to there, and again, this is not to get into that now, but it's certainly an interesting discussion, is that in an impending catastrophe, it would be natural for at least a somewhat advanced culture to want to preserve as much ecological diversity as possible.
Yeah.
Right. So in the aftermath of a catastrophe, you could replant, replenish, whatever the case may be. Right. And it's so, from what I've studied, though, I mean, I've been out in the field. I've covered at least several 100,000 miles, literally, in the last quarter century, in the field, personally studying, observing, documenting evidence for large-scale fluvial hydrology.
Yeah.
Okay? We're talking about flood discharges, peak flood discharges that in some cases are well over 500 million cubic feet per second.
Wow.
How do you even visualize something like that? Well, I'll tell you this. I very confidently refer to a flow of water on that scale as being biblical in scale, in the sense that if you were in a landscape where you had the ability to survive an event like this, and I'll segue for a second. I take people on tours to teach them about catastrophic or cataclysmic paleohydrology in the field, show them how to read the landscape. When I take a group, one of the first places I take them in eastern Washington is a place called Steptoe Butte. Steptoe Butte's about 1,200 feet, rises. It's an old volcanic core, hard volcanic rock that rises about 1,100 or 1,200 feet above the surrounding rolling Palouse farmland. Well, the rolling Palouse was shaped by huge volumes of water moving relatively sluggish over the landscape, as opposed to a little further west where you can see huge volumes of water moving at rapid velocities. Well, as you increase the velocity of moving water, you also increase the erosive potential of that water.
Okay.
If it's slow, it's going to tend to maybe entrain sediment, but not transport it. In some of the flood pathways that we go through, we'll see piles of boulders that are the size of school buses and bigger.
Wow.
Those are boulders that are being carried in some of these peak discharges. If we had a ability to share a screen, I would pull up and I would actually show you some photographs of the features left over, because when you have 500 million cubic feet per second flowing over the land, after that flood is over, it's left very distinctive, very impressive geomorphic work on that landscape that once you know how to read it, it's indisputable, unmistakable. Okay, so here's what I'm getting at, is that if you were up on top of Steptoe Butte during the peak of this, say, some of these great floods that swept over eastern Washington at the end of the last ice age, and you were somehow lucky enough to survive, in the aftermath of that event, in every direction you would see as far as the eye could see, whatever had been there was gone, was wiped out.
Wow.
And that's the reason I bring people there for the first for one of our first outings. You get on the top of there and you have a 360-degree view of the horizon. And when I took Graham Hancock on this tour of the floodlands, one of the first places we stopped is at a place called Wallula Gap. And it's right up on top of a cliff, and there's a mile-wide gap, 1,200 feet deep roughly, where all of this flood water coming from multiple sources out of Canada and Montana converged on this gap. And as you look to the east, again, as far as the eye could see, everything that you're looking at would have been underwater. As far as the eye could see, and you're looking at 20, 30 miles because you're up on this ridge. And the water that came through, where I took Graham, I brought him up to the point where we were standing right at the shoreline of the high water mark when all of this water is converging on this gap and forcing its way through. And you could look over on the other side of the gap, which was a little bit lower, which was now completely underwater, and you could see massive pothole erosion. You could see spired rocks that were left in the aftermath. You could tell that there were incredible energies unleashed on this landscape, right? Now, all of this is due to the rapid and catastrophic melting of those ice sheets, which kind of brings us right back full circle to the question of Atlantis, because